In this lesson, we're going to take our footage into Match Mover and create a few base tracks. So I've just opened up Match Mover here, and let's click Import Sequence. And inside of your project files, you'll find a footage folder. And here we have our picture frame. So just run with the default settings, frame rate of 24, and setting the end. Now before manual tracking, let's rewind this and hit play and make sure we cache in our entire sequence because that's going to make tracking much faster. Now we have a relatively short sequence here, and as we talked about in the previous lesson, we used a lot of tracker points to make tracking much easier. So let's come in and now track these out. So I'm just going to right click, new track, and let's begin by tracking these corner pieces here. So I'm going to track the inside of this dot here. I'm just going to hit F3 to track forward. Now it's going to do its best to track forward, and it does pretty well, but it gives us a little bit of a yellow here. So let's just set an end keyframe and then hit F4 to track backwards and clean that up. Okay, now let's again right click, new track. And we can actually, for this one, let's actually go to the tip of this. It'll track a little bit easier, as we can see here. Tip is a little bit more defined than that centerpiece. So let's again continue in and continue to add our tracks here. And if we choose the tip of this marker as opposed to that center line, we get a much more stable track, as you can see. Now for this top part here, we're going to need to be careful because this part of our depth indicator is covering up our tracker here. So let's actually just track one of the corners, let's say the top right corner here. And hit F3, and we can see that didn't do a very good job tracking. So let's double check and make sure that we're tracking based off of the color channels. So let's go to Edit Preferences, let's go to 2D Auto Tracking, and let's track, instead of using gray levels, let's use colors. And this should help us track the difference between this pink line and this, or this pink box and this green background. So let's just select our tracker here, and we can hit delete to remove that again. Let's reselect it, retrack. Now again, it still gives us a rather red and yellow checked track mark, and that's simply because the color change happens rather extremely for this image. But as we can see, it is pretty well locked on to our track here. Let's just come in and hit F4 to clean this track up a little. Okay, it's looking much better. So now that we've got our base tracks in, we can begin tracking out this depth area of our scene. So let's now track one of these top areas here, and since this was out of focus, it's going to be a little bit difficult to track. So let's try and choose a very high contrast area, let's say the tip of this track marker here. Hit F3 to track forward, and it looks like it did pretty well. Let's come in and add a keyframe so we can hit F4 so we can track both backwards and forwards. Clean that up a little bit. And let's again hit F3, and that was green the rest of the way. Okay. Looking good. So now we need to track as many depths as we can, so let's track this depth right here. So right click, new track, and let's again select the tip of that track marker, and let's track backwards. Now there's a certain point where our tracker turns red, so we always want to be careful for those points. So let's come in, set a keyframe, let's track backwards, and again it's going to turn red. That's okay. So now let's come in and let's pin our viewport, and let's actually Control-Alt, left-click and drag to zoom in to this track 6. And using this, we can really see if our tracker is staying on target. Let's come in here, and let's set a few keyframes, or we can just left-click and drag this tracker. I believe we placed it in the middle of this point here, which is going to be important later that we keep it directly or about in the same spot. So we want the middle here. So let's track through that. Okay. Now this end part is going to be difficult because it is blurry and out of focus. But we should be able to pretty easily come in and guess or estimate where that is. Now if it shows us yellow, we of course need to come back and edit that to make sure that we don't have any jumping in our track. That actually looks pretty accurate. Alright, so it doesn't look like, or it looks like we're getting about the correct location here. It's of course difficult to tell because it's a little blurry, but I think that's actually going to do pretty well. So now we have 6 tracks in our scene. We can add, let's add another track at this depth here. So right click, new track. And again, I'm going to go with the highest contrast, and let's track backwards. And that was actually a pretty solid track, and that looks good. Now it looks like it jumped around a little bit, so I'm going to set another keyframe and just track backwards. Okay, looking good. So using this pin is very useful for getting the track set correctly. Okay, so now that we have 7 tracks inside of our scene, we can now come in and actually solve our camera. So we'll begin solving our camera and setting up our camera in the next lesson, as well as create our coordinate points. So in this lesson, we took a look at how to manually track various points on our object. Now, we've covered manual tracking in quite a few of our different courses, so we covered it a little bit quickly. If you want to learn more about manual tracking, we have an individual lesson solely on manual tracking, and as I said, we use it in several of our previous Match Mover courses.